Okay, now that we understand what disruptive technologies are, I'd like to just give you some more examples because, as we talked about earlier, it's extremely difficult to predict when something is going to be disruptive or not. So one of the best things that we can do is look through history at things that have proven to be disruptive as maybe an indicator of what to look for on something that we're currently observing to make a reasonable prediction about whether it will be disruptive. So we're going to go all the way back to the beginning and learn that disruptive technology isn't something new with the computing age. Things have been disruptive all through human history. So this is what international shipping used to look like. You put your goods on a ship, and maybe they get there, and maybe they don't, and that's the best you could hope for. But at some point along comes the steam engine, and international shipping becomes far more reliable. You start to see things like logistics, time schedules. You kind of knew when something was going to arrive. The insurance industry that supported this began to thrive because we actually had real data on how things were going to work. So, and you can imagine that this totally changed the business of shipping, and where markets were fundamentally changed when you had the steam engine as opposed to wooden ships. We saw a slide on this early on when we talked about disruptive technologies. That this was the horse was the gold standard of transportation for a long, long time. This was the best you could do. This was a well-to-do couple on what they, how they would get around a horse and carriage. And however long it took was how long it took a horse to get you there. And lest you think that this was, this is how far back this goes way back earlier than that. So the horse was the gold standard in transportation for many, many, many generations until it was disrupted by the horseless carriage, which was actually initially inferior to a horse, broke down more. It could be slower. Interesting thing that you see here is that this does not have a steering wheel. It actually has something that looks like reins because people didn't know what a steering wheel should actually be. There were no standards at all in early horseless carriages. But this is how this began to evolve. And what's the different characteristic? Well, I don't have to clean up after a horse anymore. I don't have to care for it. Horses are bought and sold. They die. Cars don't necessarily. At least they have to be disposed of when they stop working. So there are different performance characteristics that went along with horseless carriages as opposed to horse-drawn carriages. Interesting, this is the world's oldest car from 1884. Interesting that this was a steam horseless carriage. So not only was it somewhat inferior to a horse-drawn carriage in terms of its efficiency and speed, etc. It was absolutely inferior in terms of safety. I mean, you were sitting on top of a boiler. So if this thing exploded, you were not likely to survive it. So, but these were the technologies that were, no kidding, really being employed on trying to crack through the barrier of the horse-drawn carriage, and the horse being the standard of transportation. And of course, if you really, really had to have a horse in front of you, you could always have something like this. But we look at how this is a replacement curve on how cars eventually replaced carriages. You see that early on, carriages were few and far between. Cars were few and far between. Carriages were dominant. But then you get this crossover point around 1914, and carriages are on their way out, and cars are on their way in. And notice that the cap, the ceiling on cars is way higher than it ever was for carriages. Remember what Clayton Christensen said about disruptive technologies? They tend to take a capability or a service and bring it to the masses. So this is very typical of a disruptive technology. It doesn't just disrupt the old thing, it explodes the market and brings it to people who could have never afforded it before, which is exactly what happened with the car. Now, some other artifacts I want to talk about. This is an Apple Newton, if you've never seen one before. Dates back to the early to mid 90s. And it was Apple's first attempt at a handheld device that wasn't, this is, remember, laptops even were fairly new at that time. The Apple Newton, by all assessments, was well ahead of its time. It had all kinds of features on it that you would be comfortable with today: calendaring, note taking. You could even had a modem on it. You could do your email on it. It had all kinds of features that were great. It did not do well in the market. One of the things that we find, what we call, we refer to the limits of innovation here, is that when you come out with a product and you're innovating, you're trying to be disruptive. If the customer base can't relate, they don't know what to do with your innovation. They can see that it's cool, but they don't even know how to use it. That you have a very rough time in the marketplace, especially when it's an expensive device like this was. So these devices tend to not do well, not do well at all, even though they are extremely innovative. And what happens is they get displaced by something else that leverages the softening of the market by by its predecessor. So this is the Palm Pilot, if you remember that. That in some ways, not always, but in some ways was inferior to the Apple Newton. For example, the Apple Newton could understand any type of writing: cursive, block letters, anything. It, People would say that it didn't necessarily do it particularly well, but you weren't supposed to have to train it. With the Palm Pilot, they decided to increase the hit rate. They had you write the way they wanted you to write. So there was a language called graffiti. So it was sort of a gesture language for writing an alphabet. And that's how you would have to take your notes. And you had to learn graffiti if you were going to use a Palm Pilot. There's no two ways around it. There were a variety of other things that were actually inferior, had much less pixel space, didn't have quite as many features, but it brought the price point down. And it integrated better with PCs across. The Apple Newton was pretty much an Apple thing. They did try to reach the PC market, but not very well. So there were a number of things that Palm Pilot learned from the Apple Newton, so that it, in fact, was a very successful device in the marketplace. So again, you can't necessarily predict. Just because you were the first into the market doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the winner. Here's an interesting one, arguably one of the most disruptive technologies ever. This is the Gutenberg printing press. This brought the written word into people's homes. It wasn't there before. The way that you had to reproduce writing was literally by hand. The Gutenberg printing press changed all that. That's why the church in part was opposed to it. But remarkably innovative, and the creation of the book. So scrolls went away. Now you had bound books. And this technology has really withstood the test of time, because it really, you could argue that it still hasn't been disrupted. There's different types of printing presses now, certainly far better and efficient than this, but the fundamental premise of publishing and printing is the same. And it really wasn't actually disrupted until something like the Kindle came along as an e-reader, which gave you advanced features. There were ways of collaborating, with highlights and taking notes and other sorts of things that you can do with a Kindle that you can't do with a book. You can have your entire library on this little device, whereas you have to fill a whole bookshelf. Some people don't like to have books around. I don't. I love to have my books around, but maybe other people don't. And even this still has not really disrupted what you think of as a book. So talk about a technology that had staying power. The book certainly did. Here's an interesting one when we compare the CRT monitor to the LCD. And the LCD, of course, has been completely displaced. You can't even buy one anymore, by the LED, which is much brighter and lower power. But I want to give you this example because I want to show you how how rapidly the LCD displaced the CRT. So here's what happened here in a very short number of years. Look at the LCD curve at the beginning of 2006. By the end of 2007, it was already at the crossover point with CRTs, and CRTs were gone forever, and you'll never see them again. Very similar thing happened with LCDs and LEDs very rapidly after this. Now, now I want to kind of walk you through disruption in the computing industry. Christensen talks about the disk drives as a mover and shaker in the computing industry, but I'm going to talk about the computing industry as a whole. Look, this is a device everybody would relate to. You probably own one. You might own more than one. So you've got some type of a laptop computer that you do all your work. You do home things. You do everything on it. But this was disruptive. What was this disruptive to? It was mostly disruptive to this. So this would be a desktop PC. Now, of course, as we talked about before, you can still buy a desktop. There are certain niche markets that desktops are still the standard. For example, real hardcore gamers, they have towers. They need special purpose high-end graphics cards that you're never going to put in a laptop. You might need have an application where you're doing maybe data science, and you want many terabytes of storage on your laptop or on your computer. You're going to need a tower. So there's lots of application areas where desktops are still the dominant player. But in a lot of ways, you actually pay a premium for the desktop now, not the laptop, because the market's so much smaller. Now, going back in time, this was disruptive. What was this disruptive to? This was disruptive to this guy. Has a funny name. It used to be called the Mini. You laugh because it's certainly not Mini, but you will understand when I show you what this displays, why it was called the Mini. You'll notice that it doesn't even have a CRT. It has a teletype. But it had everything you needed, and smaller businesses were able to buy one of these. That's partly why it was disruptive. Remember, disruption brings technology to a larger market. Before this, only major corporations and government could actually own a computer, because the thing that this disrupted was this. This would be a standard mainframe computer that fills an entire room with tape drives, disk drives. This was the world when, in order to use a computer, the average person like us wouldn't ever touch it. We would actually give an order to somebody who would then execute it on our behalf in the computer center and then bring us the result back. So it was very specialized at this time, and because it was so outrageously priced, there were only a very small number of computers existed, period. So you see how I'm showing you disruption in reverse as we go all the way back. Now let's go back to the beginning, to where we started here with this device that we all have, and let's kind of look the other way of things that are disrupting this. So we're already seeing that tablets, like this is an Amazon Fire or an iPad. A lot of people don't own a laptop anymore. They just use a tablet device and maybe have a keyboard, and that's all they need. So for a lot of people, this has been disruptive to the laptop industry. Now, what's maybe going to be disruptive to this? Think about something like this. This is a defunct product called Google Glass, which is bringing an eye-worn device up to your eyes. So you can imagine someday having a cell phone device where the display on the cell phone isn't really important anymore because you can deliver the video up to your eye. Why do I need to look at my cell phone anymore? Because it's delivered up to my glasses. That's really what Google was after here. So we're not quite there yet, but this is kind of where we see the market going. This is something called the HoloLens for what would be an augmented reality type of an application. You might see this in manufacturing, you may see it in medicine. There's lots of different domains you might see a HoloLens type of devices readily available today. Now, getting back to what Christensen talked about, this is a Winchester drive. So this is a magnetic disk on a spindle. with a seeking arm that has a high bandwidth interface that you plug into your PC. This was extraordinarily innovative and disruptive in its day, as Christensen talked about. But of course, this is being disrupted, right? This was originally disrupted by this guy, right? The little thumb drive. And we've seen thumb drives fall out of favor because, first of all, it's really hard to use thumb drives in a non-promiscuous way, in a way that doesn't open yourself to all sorts of viruses and bad things getting on your computer, which is why we in government they've almost been forbidden for over a decade now. But still, they were disruptive because why did I need a disk drive when I could have mass storage on a tiny little thing like this? And you see what happened with USB stick prices over time, where the number of gigabytes on the sticks got rapidly increased and the prices rapidly fell. Definitely disruptive, and disrupted by cloud computing, things like Google Drives, Box.com, all the different cloud-based, OneDrive would be another example of all the different cloud-based file storage mechanisms that you have that are available to you today. A couple of other examples here. So this would be what is now Apple Music, used to be iTunes, disrupted the CD industry. If you look here at what happened in music sales over time, right? Look at how single downloads right around the introduction of iTunes shot through the roof, and CDs have since declined rapidly. And have continued to decline. It's funny that there's actually, in a lot of ways, there's a bigger market for vinyl now than there actually is for CDs. Because if you're going to go digital, why not just do it by track and do a download onto your music device or your iPhone rather than have a CD? Some people just really prefer the vinyl. There's reasons why they like the vinyl, and so they'll go do that again. But there's really no reason to actually have CDs anymore. So that market has fallen through the floor. You think about music and DVDs over time. Here you see CD sales are going down. DVD sales shot up, but basically plateaued off because they are being disrupted by these guys. So now streaming services have gotten to the point where lots of people see no reason to have DVD collections at home because they get enough of what they want from whatever streaming services that they have. So let's just quickly talk about a little bit about what kinds of things might we be paying attention to that are disruptive now. Couple of examples you might not have thought of. I would argue that terrorism itself is disruptive. It's asynchronous, it's asymmetric, as being disruptive. That what commonly was referred to as warfare now is being brought to what used to be a state-run activity is now being run by small terrorist organizations, so under Christensen's definition, terrorism has brought warfare to a wider selection of participants than it ever did before. Not that we're happy about that, but it isn't. I think you could make an argument that terrorism itself is disruptive. What about cybersecurity and hacking? When a high school kid in his basement on his PC can be hacking into government systems, hacking into corporate systems, accessing private data, that's extremely asymmetric and can be extraordinarily disruptive in terms of forcing business models to change as a result of that asymmetry. And of course, you think about cell phones are obviously disruptive. I don't think I need to expand on that too much. They are high-performance computing devices that you hold in your pocket. They have disrupted so many different things. Now think about video conferencing, collaboration tools. Skype is going away, but Microsoft Teams, Zoom, Google Meet, all these tools are enormously disruptive. They've been disruptive to the workplace. We're seeing a movement now of trying to balance being in the office versus being at home. But these tools have allowed people to work from anywhere. And that has changed the nature of work. It has changed the nature of the workplace. Um, Certainly, social media has been disruptive. And all these variety of different tools, the way they interact with each other, the way information moves through a social network, it can be extremely disruptive. As an example of this, if you remember the so-called Arab Spring, this was modeling. I think this was from Wired, was modeling the flow of information as people were connected to other people, and by tracking their language. Blue is English, red is Arabic. Just watching the flow of information over time. Here's a list of, and I would argue that all of these are disruptive. You can look down the list yourself. Every one of these was disruptive to a varying degree. Some extraordinarily, some maybe not so much. But lots of things are disruptive. But as I said earlier, most things are not. By far, most things are not disruptive. Remember, disruption has to disrupt. It has to change the nature of the marketplace. It can't just be even like a breakthrough technology, as Christensen says. That's not sufficient. Just because you made something way, way better may not mean that you've changed people's lives or the way they use your product at all. If people find that the way they do things, the way they buy things, the way they conduct their business is fundamentally changed, you probably have been disruptive. Um, in the medical field, think about things like medical imaging. Right now, I'm just going to give you a list of things that, and just suggest that maybe they are disruptive. I leave it for those of you in medicine and healthcare to tell me what you think about whether medical imaging itself has been disruptive. Or how about nanomedicine and all the promise that brings? Minimally invasive surgery, possibly. Maybe genomics, proteomics, I think you could make a strong argument that they are disruptive. Theragnosis, the same thing, right? With diagnosis and therapy, and coupling them could easily be disruptive. So here's now you know how to do a disruptive innovation analysis because you have a definition, you know how to apply it to a particular case, you know what data you need to collect to actually do an analysis to determine whether something is disruptive. So I just thought it would be helpful to give you a number of examples from industry for you to think about that might help us to better understand how disruptive technologies work, both looking backwards and looking forwards.